Welcome back. Tonight, imagine standing in a quiet European forest 8,000 years ago. The land is wild, the rivers untouched, and small bands of hunters move through the trees as they always have. For thousands of years, life here has changed very little. But far to the southeast, something new has already begun. Farmers carrying unfamiliar seeds, animals, and a completely different way of living are slowly moving across the land. They are not conquerors. There are no armies. And yet, over the next centuries, their arrival will quietly transform an entire continent. In this episode, we'll explore how agriculture spread from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, and how this slow migration would reshape human life in ways no one at the time could possibly understand. 8,000 years ago, Europe was a land of forests. From the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Great Plains stretching toward the east, the continent was covered by dense woodlands, winding rivers, and wetlands that shifted with the seasons. Oak, elm, hazel, and pine formed vast canopies over landscapes where sunlight rarely reached the ground uninterrupted. To modern eyes, accustomed to fields, roads, and cities, this world would appear almost unrecognizable. There were no borders, no nations, no farms, only wilderness. The Ice Age had ended several thousand years earlier, and as the glaciers retreated northward, life slowly returned to lands that had once been locked in ice. Forests expanded across the continent, and with them came animals that would shape the rhythms of human life. Red deer moving through open woodland, wild boar rooting in the undergrowth, elk roaming marshy lowlands, and great herds of aurochs, the massive wild cattle that once dominated European plains. Along rivers and lakes, fish were abundant. Waterfowl gathered in wetlands. Nuts, berries, and wild grains could be gathered seasonally from the land. For the human communities who lived here, survival depended on understanding these landscapes intimately. They were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. Small bands of people moved through the forests, following patterns that had been refined over thousands of years. In spring and summer, groups might gather near rivers and lakes where fish and birds were plentiful. In autumn, forests provided hazelnuts and other wild foods that could be collected and stored. In winter, hunting large animals became more important for survival. Movement was not random. It followed the rhythms of the land. These communities understood migration routes, seasonal plants, and animal behavior in ways that modern observers can only partially reconstruct. Knowledge of the landscape was passed from one generation to the next, not through written records, but through memory, tradition, and experience. Groups were small, often numbering only a few dozen people. Larger populations would have been difficult to sustain in environments where food availability changed throughout the year. Instead, communities spread across the land, maintaining flexible territories that allowed them to move as resources shifted with the seasons. Archaeological discoveries give us glimpses into these lives. Stone tools, carefully shaped from flint, were used for hunting, cutting, and preparing food. Bone and antler were crafted into fishing hooks, harpoons, and needles. Simple shelters were built from wood, animal skins, and other natural materials. Nothing about these societies was primitive, in the sense we often imagine. Their survival depended on deep knowledge, cooperation, and careful adaptation to the environments around them. For thousands of years, this way of life endured. Across Europe, hunter-gatherer societies formed a complex mosaic of cultures and traditions. Different regions developed their own tool styles, hunting techniques, and social practices, shaped by the environments in which they lived. In coastal areas, communities relied heavily on fish and shellfish. In forested interiors, hunting deer and wild boar played a central role. In the northern regions, where winters were long and harsh, survival required careful planning and strong social cooperation. Despite these regional differences, one thing united these communities: mobility. People moved through landscapes rather than permanently reshaping them. The forests were not cleared. The rivers were not redirected. The land remained largely as it had been for millennia. Human populations were small compared to what would come later. The entire continent likely held only a few million people at most, scattered across enormous stretches of wilderness. For long periods of time, human presence left only faint traces on the landscape. A temporary camp near a riverbank, a hearth where fires once burned, a scatter of stone tools left behind after a hunting expedition. These traces are often all that remain for archaeologists to reconstruct lives lived thousands of years ago. Yet these societies were not static. Over generations, hunter-gatherer groups adapted continuously to changing climates and shifting environments. The end of the Ice Age had brought warmer temperatures, rising sea levels, and expanding forests. Communities adjusted their movements, diets, and technologies accordingly. In many ways, these societies were remarkably resilient. Their way of life had supported human communities for tens of thousands of years. But far beyond the forests of Europe, something new had already begun to emerge. In the lands of the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of the modern Middle East, human communities were experimenting with a different relationship to the natural world. Instead of simply following the cycles of wild plants and animals, people began to influence those cycles. Certain wild grasses were harvested more intensively, seeds were planted deliberately, animals were managed rather than only hunted. These changes did not appear overnight. They developed gradually, over generations, as people discovered that they could shape the environment in ways that provided more reliable sources of food. In time, this process led to something entirely new in human history: agriculture. At first, this new way of life existed far from the forests of Europe. The hunter-gatherers of the continent continued their seasonal movements, unaware that a transformation had begun thousands of kilometers away. But ideas, technologies, and people have always moved across landscapes. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the knowledge of farming began to travel. Over the centuries that followed, small communities carrying crops, animals, and new ways of living would move gradually toward Europe. They did not arrive as conquerors. There were no invading armies, no dramatic moments recorded in chronicles. Instead, the change came quietly. Generation by generation, settlement by settlement, a different relationship between humans and the land would begin to take root. And when it did, the forests of Europe would never again be quite the same. Long before farming appeared in Europe, human communities in another part of the world had already begun to change their relationship with nature. This transformation took place in a region historians now call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc of land stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through parts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Today, the region is often dry and politically divided, but thousands of years ago, its landscapes offered a combination of environments that made early experimentation with plants and animals possible. Rolling hills supported wild grasses. River valleys provided fertile soil and reliable water. Seasonal climates encouraged the growth of plants that could be harvested and stored. For many generations, the people who lived in this region were hunter-gatherers, much like those in Europe. They moved through landscapes gathering wild grains, hunting animals, and following seasonal cycles that determined where food could be found. But gradually, something subtle began to change. Among the plants growing naturally in this region were wild ancestors of wheat and barley. These grasses produced edible seeds that could be collected, dried, and ground into flour. For hunter-gatherer communities, These plants were already valuable food sources. But repeated harvesting began to reveal something important. If seeds from these plants were scattered near campsites or disturbed soil, they would sometimes grow again the following year. At first, this may have seemed like little more than coincidence. But over generations, people began to recognize patterns. Seeds planted deliberately could produce new crops. Certain plants produced larger or more reliable yields. Some areas of land were better suited for growth than others. These observations did not immediately create agriculture as we understand it today. Instead, they began a long process of gradual experimentation. People continued to gather wild plants, but they also began to influence which plants grew and where. The same process occurred with animals. In the hills and grasslands of the region lived wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. For thousands of years, these animals had been hunted by human communities. But eventually, people began managing some of them rather than simply killing them. Young animals might be captured and raised. Herds could be guided toward areas where food was plentiful. Certain animals might be protected so that they could reproduce. Over time, this relationship slowly changed the animals themselves. Domesticated species began to emerge, animals that were smaller, less aggressive, and more suited to living near human communities. Like the cultivation of plants, this process took many centuries. No single generation could have recognized that they were creating something entirely new. Yet together, these gradual changes produced one of the most significant transformations in human history. People began producing their food rather than only gathering it. This shift altered nearly every aspect of daily life. Hunter-gatherer communities had traditionally moved across large territories in search of seasonal resources. But farming required something different. Fields needed to be planted, tended, and harvested. Crops had to be protected from animals and stored after they were gathered. This meant people could no longer move constantly across the landscape. Instead, they began to settle. Some of the earliest villages appeared during this period. Archaeological sites reveal clusters of houses made from mud brick or stone, often arranged around shared spaces where food was processed or stored. These communities were still small by modern standards, but they represented a profound change in how humans organized their lives. For the first time, many people lived permanently in one place. With permanent settlements came new challenges. Food needed to last through the year, especially during seasons when crops could not be harvested. Storage pits and early forms of pottery were developed to protect grain from moisture and pests. Tools designed for farming began to appear as well. Stone blades were set into wooden handles to create sickles used for harvesting grain. Grinding stones were used to turn seeds into flour. Digging tools allowed people to prepare soil for planting. Over time, farming communities developed more complex ways of organizing their labor. Planting, harvesting, animal care, food preparation, and construction all required time and cooperation. As these systems became more efficient, populations began to grow. Agriculture allowed communities to produce more food than hunter-gatherer lifestyles typically supported in the same area. More food meant more people could survive, and more children could be raised within a settlement. Gradually, villages expanded. What had once been small clusters of families grew into communities with dozens or even hundreds of inhabitants. Social structures became more complex. Different individuals began specializing in different tasks. Some focused on farming, others on tool-making, pottery, or construction. Trade networks also began to emerge. Communities exchanged materials that were not available locally: obsidian for tools, shells for decoration, and other valuable goods. Ideas moved along these networks as well. Techniques for growing crops, caring for animals, and constructing homes spread from one community to another. In this way, agriculture slowly expanded across the region. But the spread of farming was not only a matter of ideas. People themselves moved. As populations grew, some communities began searching for new land where crops could be planted and animals raised. This movement did not resemble the migrations often described in later historical periods. There were no massive waves of people moving across continents. Instead, small groups gradually relocated, carrying with them the knowledge and practices that had developed over generations. With each new settlement, agriculture spread a little farther. Over time, farming communities expanded beyond the original regions where domestication had first begun. Some groups moved westward. Others traveled north. Eventually, these movements would bring farming cultures to the edges of a continent that had never seen them before. Beyond the mountains and seas that separated these regions lay Europe, a land still dominated by forests and inhabited by hunter-gatherer societies whose ways of life had endured for thousands of years. When the first farmers finally arrived there, they would bring more than crops and animals. They would bring a completely different way of living. And with it, the beginning of a transformation that would unfold across the entire continent. By the time agriculture had begun to spread beyond its earliest centers, it had already reshaped the lives of the people who practiced it. The change was not simply about growing food. It altered how communities organized their time, how they built their homes, and how they understood the land around them. For hunter-gatherers, life had long been structured around movement. Groups followed the seasonal availability of resources, shifting their camps as animals migrated or plants became ready for harvest. Mobility allowed them to adapt to the rhythms of nature without exhausting any single area of land. Farming required a very different approach. Crops could not be harvested immediately after planting. Fields needed time to grow. They needed care, protection, and attention throughout the year. Once seeds were placed into the soil, the people who planted them had reason to stay. Gradually, farming communities became more settled. Villages began to appear across parts of the Near East. These were not large cities, at least not yet, but they were permanent settlements in ways that earlier camps had never been. Homes were constructed from materials available nearby. In many areas, walls were built from mud bricks shaped by hand and left to dry in the sun. Roofs were supported by wooden beams and covered with layers of clay or plant material. Houses often stood close together, forming clusters that reflected family connections and shared labor. Life inside these early villages followed new rhythms. Planting seasons required preparation of the soil. Crops needed tending throughout their growth. Harvest periods demanded intense effort as grain was gathered, processed, and stored before winter. Agriculture introduced a calendar built around the cycles of cultivation. Where hunter-gatherers had moved across landscapes, farmers now organized their lives around fields. Animals also became part of this new system. Domesticated sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and wool. Cattle could be used for labor as well as food. These animals required grazing areas and protection from predators. Managing herds became another responsibility within village life. Together, crops and livestock formed the foundation of an agricultural economy. Food was no longer entirely dependent on the unpredictable success of hunting or the seasonal availability of wild plants. Instead, communities could produce much of what they needed themselves. But this new stability came with new forms of work. Farming demanded long hours of physical labor. Fields had to be cleared of vegetation and prepared for planting. Crops needed protection from animals and pests. Harvesting grain required careful cutting and processing. Grinding grain into flour, often done using heavy stones, was time-consuming work that became a daily task in many households. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming did not necessarily make life easier. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests that early farmers often worked harder and faced new health challenges. Living in permanent settlements meant people lived closer together, which made the spread of disease more likely. Diets that depended heavily on a few staple crops could also lead to nutritional imbalances. Yet despite these challenges, farming continued to expand. One reason was its ability to support larger populations. A single area of farmland could provide food for more people than the same area used only for hunting and gathering. As agricultural communities grew, they began to form more complex social structures. Families lived close together in villages that could contain dozens or even hundreds of individuals. Cooperation became essential for tasks such as planting, harvesting, building homes, and caring for animals. Over time, differences within communities also began to emerge. Some individuals may have become more skilled in certain crafts, making pottery, shaping tools, or constructing buildings. Others focused primarily on farming or managing animals. These early forms of specialization allowed societies to become more organized and efficient. Trade also began to play a larger role. Not every community had access to the same resources. Some regions produced high-quality stone for tools. Others had access to shells, pigments, or minerals used for decoration. Villages began exchanging goods with neighboring communities, creating networks that spread materials and ideas across growing distances. Through these interactions, knowledge moved alongside objects. Techniques for pottery, construction, and farming spread gradually from one community to another. Over generations, agriculture became firmly established across large areas of the Near East. The transformation that had begun with small experiments in planting and animal management had now created stable farming societies. These societies were no longer simply adapting to nature. They were shaping it. Fields replaced wild grasslands. Animals were bred and managed by humans. Settlements altered the landscapes around them. For the first time in human history, people were beginning to transform the environment on a significant scale. Yet the lands of Europe remained largely untouched by these changes. Across the forests and river valleys of the continent, hunter-gatherer communities continued living in ways that had sustained their ancestors for thousands of years. They moved with the seasons, hunted wild animals, and gathered plants from landscapes that still remained mostly wild. But the distance separating these two worlds was slowly shrinking. As farming populations grew in the Near East, some communities began moving outward in search of new land. Beyond the eastern Mediterranean lay regions that had never experienced agriculture. The mountains and coastlines of Anatolia would soon become one of the first gateways through which this new way of life would begin its journey toward Europe. And when it arrived there, it would bring with it not just crops and animals, but a completely different relationship between people and the land they lived on. For thousands of years, farming remained largely confined to the regions where it had first developed. But agriculture carried within it a quiet force that would eventually push it beyond its original homeland. Population growth. Farming communities could support more people than hunter-gatherer societies living on the same land. Crops provided reliable food supplies, and stored grain could sustain villages through difficult seasons. As populations increased, new challenges began to appear. Land that had once been plentiful became more limited. Fields needed time to recover after repeated planting, and expanding communities required additional space for crops and grazing animals. For some groups, the solution was simple. They moved. These movements were not sudden migrations across continents. Instead, they unfolded gradually, often over many generations. A small group might leave an established village and travel a short distance to settle new land. Over time, their children and grandchildren would repeat the same process, slowly extending the boundaries of farming communities. Through countless small decisions like these, agriculture began to spread. One of the most important regions along this path was Anatolia. Situated between the Near East and Europe, Anatolia formed a natural bridge between continents. Its landscapes included fertile plains, mountain valleys, and coastal regions well suited to early agriculture. By around 7000 BCE, farming had already become established across large parts of this region. Archaeological discoveries reveal villages where crops such as wheat and barley were cultivated, and animals like sheep and goats were raised. These communities built houses of mud brick and timber, often arranged close together in clusters that reflected strong social ties. Within these settlements, daily life followed the rhythms of agriculture. Fields were planted in spring. Harvests were gathered in summer and autumn. Grain was stored to sustain the community through winter. Tools designed for farming had become common. Pottery allowed food to be cooked and stored more efficiently. Grinding stones turned grain into flour for bread or porridge. In many ways, these villages represented a fully developed farming lifestyle. But Anatolia was not only a place where agriculture flourished. It was also a crossroads. Trade routes passed through the region, connecting communities across large distances. Materials such as obsidian, a volcanic glass highly valued for making sharp tools, moved along these networks, carried from one settlement to another. Along with objects, knowledge traveled as well. Ideas about farming techniques, construction methods, and craft production spread between communities. These connections helped farming societies expand and adapt as they moved into new environments. Eventually, some of these communities began looking beyond Anatolia itself. To the west lay lands that had never experienced agriculture before. Across narrow straits and along coastal routes stretched the southeastern edge of Europe, a region that would become the first European landscape transformed by farming. The transition did not happen overnight. Small groups likely crossed into Europe in different ways. Some traveled along the Mediterranean coastline, moving gradually from one coastal region to another. Others may have crossed narrow waterways into the Balkans, bringing with them domesticated plants, animals, and the knowledge required to cultivate them. When these early farmers entered Europe, they encountered landscapes that were both familiar and different. Like the Near East, parts of southeastern Europe contained fertile river valleys and temperate climates that could support agriculture. But the continent was also covered in dense forests and inhabited by communities whose way of life had developed without farming. The first agricultural settlements in Europe began appearing in areas where conditions were most favorable. River valleys provided water and fertile soil. Open landscapes made it easier to clear land for fields. Gradually, villages began to appear in regions that had previously been occupied only by seasonal camps of hunter-gatherers. The arrival of these farming communities marked the beginning of one of the most important transformations in European history. For the first time, permanent agricultural settlements existed on the continent. Fields were planted where forests had once grown undisturbed. Domesticated animals grazed in landscapes where only wild herds had previously roamed. The changes were still limited at first. Hunter-gatherer societies continued to occupy large parts of Europe, living much as their ancestors had for thousands of years. But a new way of life had arrived. It would not remain confined to a few isolated settlements. Over the centuries that followed, farming communities would spread farther across the continent, moving along rivers, across plains, and through regions that had long been dominated by forests. And as they did, they would begin to encounter the people who had lived in these landscapes long before agriculture arrived. Those encounters would shape the next chapter of this quiet but profound transformation. By around 7000 BCE, the first farming communities had begun to establish themselves in southeastern Europe. One of the most important regions in this early transition was the Balkans, a landscape of river valleys, rolling hills, and fertile plains that stretched between the Mediterranean and the interior of the continent. For early agricultural societies arriving from Anatolia, the Balkans offered conditions that made settlement possible. The climate was relatively mild. Rainfall supported plant growth. Rivers created natural corridors through forests and mountains. These landscapes allowed farming communities to plant crops and raise animals much as they had done farther east. Gradually, small villages began to appear. Archaeological sites across the region reveal early settlements where domesticated wheat and barley were grown, and animals such as sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle were kept close to human homes. These villages were still small, but they represented something entirely new for Europe. Permanent farming communities. Homes were often built using timber frames covered with clay or mud. Floors were packed earth. Roofs were made from wood and thatch. Some houses stood alone, while others formed clusters that likely represented extended families living and working together. Within these settlements, daily life followed the patterns already established in earlier farming societies. Fields were planted in spring. Crops were harvested in late summer. Grain was dried, stored, and processed for food throughout the year. Domesticated animals grazed nearby and were brought into protected areas during colder months. These communities were not isolated. Rivers such as the Danube and its tributaries served as natural routes connecting different settlements. People traveled along these waterways, exchanging goods and ideas. Pottery styles, tools, and ornaments found at archaeological sites suggest that early farming villages across the Balkans were part of networks that stretched across large areas. One of the most striking features of these early European farming cultures was their pottery. Clay vessels appear in many settlements, carefully shaped and often decorated with patterns that reflected local traditions. Pottery served practical purposes, storing grain, cooking food, and carrying liquids. But it also reveals the emergence of shared cultural identities within these early communities. Beyond pottery, tools designed for agricultural life became increasingly common. Stone axes were used to clear forests. Sickles with sharp stone blades allowed farmers to harvest grain efficiently. Grinding stones turned harvested seeds into flour. Together, these tools allowed communities to reshape the landscapes around them. Fields were cleared from woodland. Trees were cut to create space for crops and grazing animals. For the first time in European history, humans began systematically altering large areas of land to support agriculture. But this transformation did not occur everywhere at once. The early farming villages of the Balkans existed alongside vast regions still dominated by forests and inhabited by hunter-gatherer societies. These groups had lived in southeastern Europe for thousands of years. Their knowledge of local environments was deep and highly developed. They understood the seasonal movements of animals, the locations of edible plants, and the rhythms of rivers and forests. For them, the arrival of farming communities represented something entirely unfamiliar. People who stayed in one place. People who cleared forests instead of moving through them. People who kept animals close rather than hunting them in the wild. The interaction between these two ways of life was complex. In some regions, hunter-gatherers and farmers likely lived relatively close to one another for long periods of time. They may have traded goods, meat, or wild resources in exchange for pottery, tools, or agricultural products. Ideas may have moved between these communities as well. Some hunter-gatherer groups may have gradually adopted elements of farming, while continuing to rely on traditional hunting and gathering. In other areas, the arrival of farmers may have created competition for land and resources. Fields and grazing areas could replace forests that had once supported hunting. Over time, agricultural communities often expanded into regions that had previously been used by hunter-gatherers. Yet this process unfolded slowly. For centuries, even millennia, both ways of life coexisted across parts of Europe. The Balkans became one of the first regions where this interaction took place on a large scale. From here, farming would continue spreading in multiple directions. Some communities moved northward along the great river systems of Central Europe. Others followed the Mediterranean coast westward, gradually introducing agriculture to new regions. Each movement carried with it the same essential elements: domesticated crops, managed animals, and the knowledge required to cultivate land. With each new settlement, agriculture extended its reach. And with every generation, the landscapes of Europe moved one step closer to a transformation that would eventually reshape the entire continent. When the first farming communities entered southeastern Europe, they did not arrive in an empty land. For thousands of years, the forests, rivers, and coastlines of the continent had been home to hunter-gatherer societies whose lives were deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. These communities were not scattered randomly across the landscape. They occupied territories that had been shaped by generations of experience and knowledge. Rivers, lakes, forests, and migration routes formed the foundation of their survival. In many ways, these societies were highly adapted to the environments in which they lived. Their tools were carefully designed for hunting and food preparation. Their movements followed seasonal patterns that allowed them to use different parts of the landscape at different times of the year. When early farmers arrived in regions such as the Balkans, they entered landscapes that were already part of these long-established systems. At first, the differences between these communities must have been striking. Farmers lived in permanent settlements. Their houses stood in fixed locations, often grouped together in villages where dozens of people shared work and resources. Nearby fields were cleared for crops, and domesticated animals were kept close to human homes. Hunter-gatherers lived very differently. Their camps were temporary or seasonal, designed to be used only for a short period before the group moved on. Their food came from hunting animals, fishing rivers, and gathering plants that grew naturally in forests and meadows. These contrasting ways of life reflected two fundamentally different relationships with the land. Hunter-gatherers adapted to nature's cycles. Farmers attempted to control them. When these communities first encountered one another, their interactions may have taken many forms. In some places, the meeting may have been cautious and curious. The arrival of farmers brought unfamiliar objects and materials. Pottery, for example, was widely used by early agricultural communities, but had been rare or absent among many European hunter-gatherers. Domesticated animals such as sheep and goats would also have appeared unusual in landscapes where animals were typically hunted rather than raised. Trade may have developed between these groups. Hunter-gatherers could offer resources that farming communities did not always have easy access to: wild game, fish, animal hides, and knowledge of local environments. Farmers in return might have provided pottery, crafted tools, or agricultural products. These exchanges may have allowed the two societies to coexist in some regions for long periods of time. Archaeological evidence suggests that this kind of interaction did occur. At certain sites, objects associated with farming communities appear alongside tools typical of hunter-gatherer cultures. Such findings hint at moments of contact, cooperation, and perhaps shared spaces. Yet coexistence was not always simple. Agriculture required land. Fields had to be cleared for crops, and grazing areas were needed for domesticated animals. These changes could gradually alter landscapes that hunter-gatherer groups had relied on for generations. A forest cleared for farming might remove habitats used by wild animals. A village built along a river might change how nearby resources were accessed. Over time, the expansion of farming communities could place pressure on traditional hunting territories. In some areas, hunter-gatherer groups may have moved to new regions where forests and wild resources remained more abundant. In other cases, individuals or families may have begun adopting aspects of the farming lifestyle. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture did not necessarily happen all at once. Some communities may have lived between these worlds, continuing to hunt and gather while also experimenting with small-scale farming or animal management. This gradual blending of practices likely occurred over many generations. The spread of agriculture across Europe was not simply the movement of crops and animals. It was also the meeting of different cultures. Each community brought its own traditions, skills, and understanding of the landscape. As they interacted, these cultures influenced one another in ways that historians and archaeologists are still trying to understand. Genetic research in recent decades has added another layer to this story. Studies of ancient DNA suggest that the first European farmers were often descendants of populations that had originally lived in the Near East and Anatolia. This indicates that agriculture did not spread only through the exchange of ideas. People themselves moved into new regions. Over time, these farming populations mixed with local hunter-gatherer groups, creating new communities that carried elements of both traditions. Through these interactions, the cultural and biological landscape of Europe slowly began to change. But in the centuries following the arrival of the first farmers, this transformation was still only beginning. Large parts of Europe remained dominated by forests and inhabited primarily by hunter-gatherer societies. Agricultural villages existed mostly in southeastern regions, where the new way of life had first taken root. Yet the process had begun. From these early points of contact, farming communities would gradually spread farther across the continent, along river valleys, across fertile plains, and into regions that had never before experienced settled agricultural life. And with each step, the balance between these two worlds would slowly begin to shift. For a long period of time, Europe was home to two very different ways of life. In many regions, hunter-gatherer communities and farming villages existed within the same landscapes, sometimes separated by only a few days' travel. Yet the rhythms of their lives could not have been more different. Hunter-gatherers continued to move through forests, river valleys, and coastal areas in patterns shaped by the seasons. Their survival depended on flexibility, the ability to follow animals, gather wild foods, and adjust to the changing availability of resources throughout the year. A typical year might involve several different camps. In spring, groups might gather near rivers where fish were plentiful. In summer, they could move into forested areas rich with berries, edible plants, and small game. Autumn often brought the harvest of nuts such as hazelnuts, which could be collected and stored for winter. When colder months arrived, hunting larger animals such as deer or wild boar became especially important. This mobility allowed hunter-gatherers to use large territories without exhausting the resources of any single place. Their impact on the landscape remained relatively light. farmers lived according to a very different set of rhythms. Their lives were tied to the land they cultivated. Fields had to be planted at the right time of year. Crops needed tending during their growth. Harvest seasons demanded intense work to gather food before autumn rains or early frosts could destroy it. Because crops grew in fixed locations, farming communities remained close to their fields. Villages became permanent centers of life. Homes were rebuilt in the same places generation after generation. Storage pits and pottery allowed grain to be preserved for months or even years. Domesticated animals grazed near settlements and were protected from predators. The relationship between humans and the environment was changing. Where hunter-gatherers adapted to nature's patterns, farmers increasingly reshaped the landscape to meet their needs. Forests were cleared to create open fields. Trees were cut for building materials and fuel. Animals that had once lived wild were now raised within human communities. The contrast between these two lifestyles extended beyond food production. It influenced how people organized their societies. Hunter-gatherer groups tended to remain relatively small. Mobility limited how many people could travel together, and large populations would have placed too much pressure on local resources. Social structures were often flexible, with leadership based on experience, skill, or respect rather than permanent authority. In farming villages, larger populations became possible. Agriculture produced food surpluses that could support more people living in a single place. Villages might contain dozens of houses, and extended families often lived close together. Permanent settlements also created new forms of organization. Fields had to be managed, harvests needed to be coordinated. Shared spaces within villages required cooperation between households. Over time, these factors contributed to more structured communities. Another difference involved time itself. Hunter-gatherer societies lived according to natural cycles, the migrations of animals, the ripening of plants, the freezing and thawing of rivers. Farmers developed calendars tied to planting and harvesting seasons. Their lives became organized around agricultural tasks that repeated year after year. This shift toward predictable annual cycles would later influence everything from religious rituals to systems of record keeping. Yet for many centuries, these two worlds continued to exist side by side. In some areas, hunter-gatherers may have viewed farming villages with curiosity or caution. Permanent settlements filled with unfamiliar animals, fields, and pottery must have appeared unusual compared to the mobile camps they had always known. At the same time, the agricultural lifestyle offered certain advantages. Farming communities could store food and remain in one place throughout the year. Their populations often grew more quickly than those of hunter-gatherer groups. Over generations, these differences began to influence the balance between the two societies. In some regions, hunter-gatherer groups gradually adopted elements of farming. They may have begun cultivating small plots of land while still relying heavily on hunting and gathering. Domesticated animals might have been incorporated into traditional lifeways. In other regions, farming communities expanded into new territories, gradually replacing older ways of living. The spread of agriculture across Europe did not happen through a single process. Sometimes ideas moved between cultures. Sometimes people themselves moved into new regions. Often, the transformation involved a mixture of both. What is clear is that agriculture continued to expand. From its early foothold in southeastern Europe, farming began spreading along some of the continent's most important natural routes. One of the most significant of these pathways followed the great river systems of Central Europe, corridors that would carry agricultural societies deep into lands that had long been dominated by forests and hunter-gatherer traditions. Along these rivers, a new farming culture would soon emerge, one that archaeologists would later recognize by the distinctive patterns decorating its pottery. And through these communities, agriculture would begin transforming the heart of Europe. As farming communities became established in southeastern Europe, agriculture did not remain confined to the Balkans. Over the centuries that followed, the new way of life began moving steadily farther into the continent. The spread was not sudden. Instead, it unfolded gradually, as small groups of farmers established new settlements beyond the edges of existing villages. Each generation moved only a little farther than the last, but over time, these movements carried agriculture across enormous distances. One of the most important pathways for this expansion followed Europe's great river systems. Rivers such as the Danube formed natural corridors through dense forests and mountainous landscapes. They provided water, fertile soil, and relatively open routes for travel and communication. For early farmers seeking new land, these river valleys offered ideal environments for settlement. Fields could be planted in fertile floodplains. Nearby forests provided timber for building houses and tools. Rivers offered fish and transportation routes linking communities across large regions. As agricultural groups moved along these waterways, new farming cultures began to appear. Among the most significant of these early European farming societies was what archaeologists now call the linear pottery culture, often abbreviated as LBK. This culture emerged around 5500 BCE and spread across large areas of Central Europe, including regions that are today part of Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. The name comes from one of the most recognizable features found at LBK archaeological sites: pottery decorated with distinctive linear patterns carved or pressed into the clay. These decorated vessels are more than simple household objects. They provide clues about the identities and traditions of the communities that created them. Pottery styles often reflect shared cultural practices, ways of making, decorating, and using objects that are passed down within communities and across generations. In the case of the linear pottery culture, similar pottery designs appear across settlements spread over vast distances. This suggests that these farming communities were connected by shared tradition and communication networks. But pottery was only one part of their cultural identity. The villages of the linear pottery culture also shared distinctive architectural patterns. One of their most characteristic structures was the longhouse. These buildings were large rectangular wooden structures that could reach more than 20 meters in length. Their timber frames were supported by massive wooden posts driven into the ground, with walls made from woven branches coated with clay. Longhouses likely served as homes for extended families, providing living space, storage areas, and protection from weather. Entire villages were often organized around clusters of these buildings. Fields of wheat and barley surrounded the settlements, while domesticated animals grazed nearby. Stone tools found at LBK sites reveal the labor required to maintain this lifestyle. Polished stone axes were used to clear forests and create farmland. Sickles with sharp stone blades allowed farmers to harvest grain efficiently. Grinding stones were used to process grain into flour, an essential step in preparing food. Through these tools and techniques, early farmers began transforming the landscapes of Central Europe. Forests that had once stretched uninterrupted across vast regions were gradually cleared to create fields and grazing land. The process was slow and labor-intensive. Clearing trees with stone axes required enormous effort, and early farmers likely worked cooperatively to open new areas of land. Yet over generations, these changes accumulated. Villages expanded. Fields grew larger. Agriculture became the dominant way of life across many parts of Central Europe. At the same time, interactions with hunter-gatherer communities continued. In some regions, archaeological evidence shows that farming villages and hunter-gatherer camps existed relatively close to one another. Trade and cultural exchange may have continued between these groups. In other regions, the expansion of agriculture may have gradually displaced older lifeways as farming populations increased. The spread of the linear pottery culture represents one of the clearest examples of how agriculture moved across Europe. Within a few centuries, farming communities connected by shared traditions extended across hundreds of kilometers. This expansion marked an important turning point in the continent's history. Agriculture was no longer limited to isolated regions near the Mediterranean or the Balkans. It had reached the heart of Europe. But the transformation of the continent was still far from complete. Beyond the regions settled by early farmers, enormous forests continued to dominate the landscape. Hunter-gatherer communities still lived across much of northern and western Europe. Yet the balance was shifting. With each new settlement, agriculture reshaped another small part of the continent. And as farmers cleared land, planted crops, and built villages, the landscapes of Europe began slowly transforming into something that would become increasingly familiar to later generations. As agriculture spread deeper into Europe, the transformation it brought was not only cultural, it was environmental. For thousands of years before the arrival of farming, the landscapes of Europe had been shaped primarily by natural forces: climate, rivers, forests, and the movement of wild animals. Human communities lived within these systems, but rarely altered them on a large scale. Hunter-gatherers moved through forests and wetlands without permanently reshaping them. Their camps were temporary. Their tools were designed for hunting and gathering rather than for transforming the land itself. Agriculture introduced a different relationship between people and the environment. For farmers, the landscape was not simply a place to live. It became something to be managed. Fields needed to be cleared of trees and undergrowth before crops could be planted. Grazing areas had to be opened for domesticated animals. Paths between settlements and fields were used repeatedly, gradually forming early routes across the land. The first step in creating farmland was often the clearing of forests. This was slow and difficult work. Using polished stone axes, early farmers cut down trees that had grown for decades or even centuries. Branches were removed, trunks were split or burned, and the remaining ground was prepared for planting. Sometimes the wood was used for building houses or fences. In other cases, it was burned, leaving behind ash that enriched the soil. This process gradually opened patches of land within otherwise dense forests. At first, these clearings may have been relatively small. But as villages expanded and populations grew, more land was required. Fields of wheat and barley began appearing in places where forests had once dominated the landscape. Domesticated animals grazed in areas that had previously been home to wild herds. Over time, these changes began altering the ecosystems of the regions where farming spread. Forests that had once stretched continuously across large areas became more fragmented. Open spaces allowed different plants and animals to appear, species that thrived in fields and grasslands rather than dense woodland. The presence of domesticated animals also introduced new pressures on the land. Sheep and goats grazed on vegetation that might otherwise have supported wild animals. Cattle trampled soil and consumed grasses across newly cleared areas. These changes did not occur instantly. For centuries, agricultural fields existed alongside large areas of untouched forest. Farming communities often settled near river valleys or fertile plains where land was easier to cultivate. But gradually, The cumulative effect of clearing land, planting crops, and grazing animals began reshaping the landscape. Archaeologists studying ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments have found evidence of this transformation. Layers of pollen trapped in mud at the bottom of lakes can reveal which plants were growing in the surrounding region at different points in time. In many parts of Europe, these records show a gradual decline in tree pollen and an increase in pollen from grasses and crops. This shift reflects the spread of agriculture. Fields replaced forests. Human activity began influencing ecosystems in ways that had rarely occurred before. The appearance of permanent villages also changed the landscape. Settlements were often surrounded by fields, grazing land, and areas where timber was gathered for building and fuel. Paths between villages gradually developed into early networks of movement across the land. Over time, some of these routes would evolve into the roads and trade paths that later connected towns and cities. But for the early farming communities themselves, the most immediate impact of these changes was practical. Agriculture allowed them to produce more food. Larger harvests meant that villages could support growing populations. As fields expanded and agricultural techniques improved, farming societies became increasingly stable and productive. This stability encouraged people to remain in the same locations for generations. Homes were rebuilt on the same sites. Fields were cultivated year after year. Communities developed deeper connections to the specific landscapes they inhabited. The idea of land as something tied to a particular community began to take root. This represented a significant shift in how humans understood their place in the environment. Hunter-gatherer societies had moved through landscapes without permanently claiming them. Farming communities, by contrast, invested labor and time into specific pieces of land. Fields cleared by one generation were inherited by the next. Villages became long-term centers of life rather than temporary camps. In this way, agriculture gradually transformed not only the physical landscape of Europe, but also the human relationship with it. Land became something people worked, managed, and depended upon year after year. And as agricultural populations continued to grow, the transformation of Europe's landscapes would accelerate. What had begun as scattered clearings in forests would eventually expand into networks of fields, villages, and cultivated land that reshaped the continent. But one of the most important consequences of this transformation was still unfolding. Agriculture did not only change landscapes, it changed populations. And as farming spread across Europe, the number of people living on the continent began to grow in ways that would shape its future for thousands of years. One of the most profound consequences of agriculture was something that could not be seen immediately in the landscape. It was the gradual increase in human population. For hunter-gatherer societies, population growth had always been limited by the availability of wild resources. Food came from animals, fish, and plants that grew naturally in the environment, and these resources could support only a certain number of people in any given area. If a group grew too large, the land could no longer provide enough food. Mobility helped manage this balance. Communities spread across large territories, and populations remained relatively small. Agriculture changed this dynamic. By cultivating crops and raising domesticated animals, farming societies could produce more food within a smaller area of land. Fields planted with wheat or barley could yield far more calories than the same land used only for hunting and gathering. Domesticated animals provided additional sources of food, meat, milk, and eventually materials such as wool. These resources made it possible for community to support larger populations. Villages that might once have contained only a few families began to grow. New houses appeared as children grew into adults and formed families of their own. Over time, clusters of settlements began to appear across agricultural regions, each connected through shared traditions and exchange networks. This growth did not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolded slowly across generations. But the long-term effect was significant. Regions where agriculture became established began supporting far more people than before. With more people came new forms of organization. Communities needed to coordinate tasks such as planting, harvesting, building homes, and managing livestock. Shared labor became increasingly important, particularly during harvest seasons when crops had to be gathered quickly before weather or animals could damage them. Larger populations also meant that villages required greater supplies of food, water, and materials. Fields had to expand. More land needed to be cleared. Settlements grew outward as communities adapted to the demands of their increasing numbers. Archaeological evidence from early farming regions suggests that this process could transform landscapes over time. Areas that once supported only small bands of hunter-gatherers began hosting networks of villages connected by paths and shared territories. These growing populations also encouraged movement into new areas. As villages became crowded or land near existing settlements became fully used, younger generations often sought new places to establish communities of their own. This expansion helped carry agriculture farther across the continent. Groups moved along rivers, across fertile plains, and into regions that had previously supported only hunter-gatherer populations. In this way, population growth and agricultural expansion reinforced one another. More food allowed populations to grow. Growing populations encouraged the search for new land. New land allowed farming to spread even farther. Over centuries, this cycle gradually transformed much of Europe. The increase in population also began changing social relationships within communities. In small hunter-gatherer groups, most individuals would have known one another closely, and decisions were often made collectively. In larger farming villages, maintaining cooperation between dozens or even hundreds of people required more structured ways of organizing daily life. Shared tasks such as building houses, clearing forests, and maintaining fields required coordination and planning. Some individuals may have taken on roles that helped organize these activities. While early farming societies were still far from the complex political systems of later civilizations, the foundations of more structured communities were beginning to appear. Population growth also increased contact between different groups. As farming villages spread across wider regions, interactions between neighboring communities became more common. Trade networks expanded, allowing goods and materials to move across greater distances. Ideas traveled alongside these exchanges. Techniques for farming, building, and crafting objects spread from one community to another, contributing to the shared cultural patterns archaeologists observe in early agricultural societies. Yet the growth of farming populations did not immediately replace older ways of life. Across large parts of northern and western Europe, hunter-gatherer societies continued living in landscapes that had not yet been transformed by agriculture. For centuries, these communities remained part of the continent's cultural mosaic. But the balance between these worlds was shifting. Wherever agriculture took hold, populations tended to grow. Over time, farming societies became increasingly prominent across the regions where they settled. This demographic change would have lasting consequences. Larger populations created the conditions for further technological developments, more complex social organization, and the expansion of trade networks. In the distant future, these same processes would eventually contribute to the rise of towns, cities, and civilizations. But in the early Neolithic period, these changes were still unfolding quietly. Villages expanded, fields multiplied, generations passed, and across the landscapes of Europe, the number of people living on the continent slowly but steadily increased. With these growing populations came another important development: the spread of new skills, tools, and technologies that helped agricultural societies adapt to the challenges of settled life. As agricultural life spread across Europe, it did more than increase the number of people living on the continent. It encouraged the development of new skills, tools, and technologies that helped communities adapt to their changing world. Hunter-gatherer societies had long been skilled toolmakers. Stone blades, bone needles, fishing hooks, and carefully crafted hunting weapons were the products of generations of knowledge and experimentation. But farming introduced new kinds of work that required new kinds of tools. Fields had to be cleared of trees and brush before crops could be planted. Soil needed to be prepared for seeds. Harvesting grain required tools that could cut plants efficiently without damaging the seeds. One of the most important innovations of this period was the development of polished stone tools. Earlier stone tools had often been made by chipping flint into sharp edges. These tools were extremely effective for cutting and scraping, but they were less suited to the heavy work required for clearing forests. Polished stone axes represented an important improvement. By grinding and polishing the surfaces of certain types of stone, early farmers created stronger and more durable tools capable of cutting through wood. These axes allowed communities to clear trees more efficiently and open larger areas of land for farming. The impact of this innovation was significant. Clearing forests remained difficult work, but polished axes made it possible to reshape landscapes in ways that had rarely been attempted before. Another important development was the widespread use of sickles for harvesting grain. These tools often consisted of curved wooden handles fitted with small stone blades made from flint. When used to cut stalks of wheat or barley, the blades created clean cuts that allowed farmers to gather crops quickly during harvest season. Harvesting efficiently was essential. Grain had to be collected before storms, animals, or rot could destroy the crop. The introduction of sickles allowed farmers to process large areas of farmland within the limited time available during harvest. Once grain had been gathered, it still needed to be processed before it could be eaten. Grinding stones became common features in farming households. These heavy stones were used to crush and grind grain into flour, which could then be cooked into porridge or baked into simple forms of bread. Grinding grain was time-consuming work. Archaeologists studying early farming communities often find evidence that this task was performed daily, becoming a central part of domestic life. Another technological change associated with early farming societies was the expansion of pottery. Clay vessels had appeared in some hunter-gatherer cultures, but they became far more common with the spread of agriculture. Pottery served many important purposes. Grain needed containers where it could be stored safely and protected from moisture and pests. Food could be cooked more easily in ceramic vessels placed near fires. Liquids could be carried and preserved in durable clay containers. Different communities developed their own pottery styles. Decorations carved or pressed into clay surfaces often reflected local traditions. Over time, archaeologists have been able to trace the movement of farming cultures by studying these pottery patterns. One well-known example is the pottery associated with the linear pottery culture, whose distinctive designs appear across large areas of Central Europe. These similarities suggest that farming communities were connected through networks of communication and shared knowledge. Craftsmanship expanded beyond tools and pottery as well. Settled life allowed individuals to develop specialized skills. Some people focused on tool-making. Others became skilled potters, builders, or artisans creating ornaments and decorative objects. Evidence of early weaving and textile production also begins to appear in some agricultural settlements. Fibers from plants or animal wool could be spun into thread and woven into fabrics, providing clothing and other useful materials. Trade networks played an important role in spreading both objects and ideas. Certain materials used for tools, such as high-quality flint or volcanic obsidian, were not available everywhere. These materials sometimes traveled hundreds of kilometers from their original sources. Communities exchanged goods with one another, creating connections across wide regions. Through these networks, knowledge moved alongside materials. New techniques for farming, tool-making, and construction spread gradually from one community to another. In this way, agricultural societies across Europe began sharing technologies that helped them adapt to their environments. Yet even with these innovations, life in early farming villages remained challenging. Clearing forests required enormous effort. Crop failures caused by drought or disease could threaten entire communities. Animals had to be protected from predators. Despite these difficulties, agriculture continued to expand. The technologies developed by early farmers made it possible to cultivate land more effectively and sustain growing populations. Generation after generation, communities improved their tools, refined their techniques, and adapted their practices to new landscapes. The result was a slow but steady transformation of life across the continent. What had begun as small villages scattered across southeastern Europe was gradually becoming a network of farming societies connected by shared knowledge and expanding populations. And although this transformation happened quietly, without dramatic events or sudden upheaval, its impact would be enormous. Over the centuries that followed, the spread of agriculture would become one of the most significant revolutions in the history of Europe. Many of the transformations that shape history happen suddenly. Empires rise and fall in dramatic conflicts. Cities are conquered. Borders change in moments of crisis that later generations remember as turning points. The spread of agriculture across Europe was nothing like that. It was a revolution without a single moment. No battle marked its beginning. No declaration announced its arrival. There was no single generation that could look around and recognize that the continent was entering a completely new age. Instead, the change unfolded slowly, often so gradually that the people living through it would hardly have noticed its full significance. A forest cleared by one family might become a field cultivated by their children. A small settlement built beside a river might slowly grow into a village as new houses appeared over decades. Neighbors might observe unfamiliar practices, crops planted in neat rows, animals raised in enclosures, pottery used to store grain, and gradually adopt some of those practices themselves. Across hundreds of years, these small decisions accumulated. Generation after generation, the agricultural way of life spread farther across the continent. In some places, the transformation happened through movement. Farming communities expanded into new territories, establishing villages where agriculture had never been practiced before. In other regions, hunter-gatherer groups gradually incorporated elements of farming into their existing lifestyles. They might begin by cultivating small plots of land or keeping a few domesticated animals while continuing to hunt and gather wild foods. Over time, these practices could become more central to their way of life. The transition was rarely uniform. Different regions of Europe experienced the spread of agriculture in different ways and at different speeds. In southeastern Europe, farming appeared relatively early and became established quickly. Central Europe followed as agricultural cultures expanded along rivers and fertile plains. Farther north and west, the transformation often took longer. In some areas, hunter-gatherer societies continued thriving for centuries after farming had appeared elsewhere on the continent. This uneven pace is one of the reasons archaeologists refer to the spread of agriculture as a process rather than a single event. It was not a sudden shift from one way of life to another. It was a long transition during which multiple ways of living coexisted. Even within farming communities, change happened gradually. Agricultural techniques improved over generations as farmers learned which crops grew best in particular soils or climates. New tools and methods were developed to make planting, harvesting, and processing food more efficient. Villages evolved as populations increased and communities adapted to the needs of settled life. The landscape itself recorded these changes. Fields replaced sections of forest. Grazing animals altered vegetation patterns. Paths between villages gradually formed networks of movement across regions. Yet despite these transformations, much of Europe still remained wild. Large forests continued covering vast territories, especially in northern and western regions. Many rivers flowed through landscapes that had changed little since the end of the Ice Age. For centuries, agriculture remained only one part of a complex human landscape that included both farmers and hunter-gatherers. But slowly the balance shifted. Farming communities tended to grow larger populations. Their settlements became more stable. Over time, these factors allowed agricultural societies to expand into new areas more consistently than mobile hunter-gatherer groups. This gradual demographic shift played an important role in the long-term spread of farming. As generations passed, the number of people living within agricultural societies increased. Their villages multiplied. Their influence on the land around them expanded. Without dramatic events or visible milestones, the continent was being transformed. The forests of Europe were no longer inhabited only by mobile bands of hunters. Across the land, communities were planting crops, raising animals, building permanent homes, and reshaping the environment to sustain their lives. The revolution was quiet, but its consequences would extend far into the future. Because the agricultural societies taking root across Europe were not simply new ways of producing food. They were the foundations upon which later civilizations would eventually grow. The early farming villages that spread across Europe during the Neolithic period were modest by later standards. They contained no cities, no written laws, and no monumental architecture like the pyramids or great temples that would appear thousands of years later in other parts of the world. Yet these small settlements laid the foundation for many of the developments that would shape the future of the continent. Agriculture created something that earlier hunter-gatherer societies rarely experienced: stability in place. When people farmed the same land year after year, their relationship with that land deepened. Fields cleared by one generation became the inheritance of the next. Homes were rebuilt on the same sites, sometimes for centuries. Villages developed long histories tied to specific locations. This stability allowed communities to accumulate knowledge. Farmers learned which soils produced the best harvests. They discovered how different crops responded to changes in weather and seasons. Techniques for planting, storing food, and caring for animals were refined through experience. These lessons were passed from parents to children, creating traditions that helped agricultural societies become more productive over time. Permanent settlements also encouraged the growth of social organization. In small hunter-gatherer groups, leadership tended to be flexible and temporary, often based on skill or experience. But larger farming villages required greater coordination. Fields had to be managed, Harvests had to be organized. Shared spaces and resources required cooperation among households. Over time, communities developed ways to manage these responsibilities. Although early farming societies were still relatively simple compared to later civilizations, the structures that supported organized social life were beginning to emerge. Trade networks also expanded as agricultural communities grew. Settled villages often remained in the same locations for generations, allowing long-distance connections to develop between different regions. Materials such as high-quality flint, obsidian, shells, pigments, and decorative stones were exchanged across wide areas. These exchanges were not limited to physical goods. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices traveled alongside trade routes. Techniques for pottery, building, farming, and craftsmanship spread gradually between communities, creating shared traditions across large regions. Another important development associated with agricultural life was the accumulation of surplus food. Harvests that produced more grain than a community immediately needed could be stored for later use. This surplus provided security during difficult seasons, but it also allowed some individuals to devote time to activities other than food production. Craftsmanship became more specialized. Some individuals focused on toolmaking or pottery production. Others became skilled builders or artisans creating decorative objects. Over time, this specialization would become an important feature of more complex societies. Agriculture also encouraged the development of rituals and beliefs connected to the cycles of nature. Planting and harvest seasons were central moments in the lives of farming communities. These events may have been accompanied by ceremonies or traditions that reflected the importance of fertility, growth, and the changing seasons. Although written records from this period do not exist, archaeological discoveries, including figurines, burial sites, and symbolic objects, suggest that early farming societies developed rich cultural and spiritual traditions. These traditions helped communities make sense of the forces that shaped their lives. The success or failure of crops could determine whether a village thrived or struggled. Rainfall, sunlight, and seasonal changes carried enormous significance. In many ways, agriculture tied human life more closely than ever to the rhythms of the natural world. Over time, these agricultural communities continued expanding across Europe. Villages multiplied, populations grew, fields spread across landscapes that had once been dominated by forests. Gradually, the agricultural way of life became the dominant form of human settlement across much of the continent. This transformation created the conditions that would later allow larger and more complex societies to develop. Permanent settlements, growing populations, trade networks, and specialized skills were all essential ingredients in the emergence of towns, cities, and civilizations. But during the early Neolithic period, these developments were still only beginning. The people clearing forests and planting crops across Europe could not have known that their daily work was helping shape the distant future. They were simply adapting to new ways of living, ways that had slowly spread from the Near East and taken root in European soil. Yet the quiet revolution they were part of would have consequences lasting thousands of years. Because by the end of this long transition, Europe was no longer simply a continent of forests and wandering hunters. It was becoming something else. A landscape shaped by fields, villages, and communities whose lives revolved around the cultivation of the land. And with that transformation, the foundations of Europe's later history were firmly in place. Looking back across thousands of years, it can be difficult to appreciate how profound this transformation truly was. For most of human history, people had lived as hunter-gatherers. For tens of thousands of years, human communities moved through landscapes following animals, gathering wild plants, and adapting to the rhythms of nature. This way of life had carried humanity across continents and through the dramatic climate changes of the Ice Age. It was the lifestyle of our species for the overwhelming majority of its existence. Then slowly something changed. In the lands of the Fertile Crescent, people began cultivating plants and managing animals. Over many generations, these experiments developed into a new way of living based on agriculture. From there, this way of life spread outward. Through regions such as Anatolia and into the Balkans, farming gradually took root in landscapes that had long been inhabited by hunter-gatherer societies. Between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 BCE, this transformation slowly spread across Europe. Villages appeared where there had once been seasonal camps. Fields replaced parts of forest that had stood for centuries. Domesticated animals grazed in landscapes where wild herds had once roamed freely. The process unfolded quietly. No single moment marked the beginning of Europe's agricultural age. Instead, the change happened through countless individual decisions: families planting crops, communities clearing fields, generations passing down new knowledge about cultivating the land. Over time, these small decisions reshaped the continent. Agriculture allowed populations to grow. Permanent settlements became more common. Trade networks expanded, connecting communities across wide distances. New tools and technologies developed as societies adapted to the demands of settled life. The landscapes of Europe began to change as well. Forests were gradually opened into fields. Paths between villages formed the early outlines of human movement across the land. Places that had once been temporary camps became permanent homes. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming did not happen everywhere at the same time. In some regions, hunter-gatherer communities continued living their traditional lifestyles for centuries after agriculture appeared nearby. For long periods, both ways of life existed side by side. But slowly the balance changed. Agricultural societies tended to support larger populations and more stable settlements. Over generations, farming became the dominant way of life across much of the continent. This transformation would shape everything that followed. The villages created by early farmers laid the groundwork for later towns. Growing populations encouraged trade, technological innovation, and more complex social structures. Over thousands of years, these developments would eventually give rise to cities, kingdoms, and civilizations. But those future societies all shared a common foundation. They depended on agriculture. The fields planted by Europe's first farmers were the beginning of a long process that would ultimately transform human life. What began as scattered settlements along rivers and fertile valleys became the starting point for the continent's later history. The change was gradual. It happened quietly, without the dramatic events that often fill the pages of history books. Yet its impact was immense. Between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE, Europe experienced one of the most important transitions in the story of humanity. A continent of forests and wandering hunters slowly became a continent of farmers. And from that transformation, the foundations of the world we know today began to emerge. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.